Hope that's a good volume. So, my name is Chris Williams, and I'm with the Crystal Lake Fire Department. I know quite a few of you. I've been with the fire department for over 30 years, but looking through the room here, that's nothing compared to some of the people that are in here. I have a lot more years than that. My history is that the person on the left is my dad, who is a volunteer fireman, and the person on the right is my Uncle Jack, who's also a fireman out in L.A. County. Third generation firefighter in my family, so that's where I get some of my background and some of my pride and all that. Unfortunately, the picture of my father on the left isn't a little bit better because we had a... Louder or softer? Okay, how's that? Better? A little better? Okay. All right. So, yeah, get the lights down a little bit too. So that's my history of third generation firefighter, so I'm very proud of that. With that also, when I started on the fire department here, the members of the department that were here taught me a lot about tradition and history and what the fire department was all about, how we help each other out, and how we move forward from there. So I thank those people also. Also, this is Chief Moore. Chief Moore is the current fire chief of the Crystal Lake Fire Department, who has also on his stands, which is very important for the fire department. And the people that, like I said, have been here in the past understand very much about how important the fire department was to the community. It wasn't just that we went out and fight fires. We did other things. Sometimes we'd go out and do things that didn't have everything to do with the fire department, but if it made someone's life better or made a situation a little bit better, we'd go out and do it to make it better for the whole community. So the fire department, over the years from when the fire department first started in Crystal Lake and the area, has a deep tradition of being people that were raised in the town, were very proud of the town, and wanted to continue to make the city a very proud place and make it as best as they could. And Chief Moore has continued that with some of our pride and traditions. In the early days, we have to look at before the fire department actually was even developed, before the city came across. It was the citizens that formed the fire department. All right? The first reported structure fire was in 1877. It was actually at the train station, and it was the people of the community and also the train engineer who actually took the steam from the train engine and put out the fire in the train station. As that started to happen and the town continued to grow, which was actually the area called Nunday, not Nunda, but it's Nunday, after a town in New York, correct? And that's how that started off with Nunday. They started realizing how important it was to have a fire protection, and because of a lot of the fires that were going on, and just have a regular water system, they started purchasing equipment, and the town of Nunday in 1899 started to install a water system with hydrants, a well, and a water tower that was located at Main Street and Beardsley Street. The tower was 30,000 gallons. In 1900, the village of Nunda Council appointed the first fire marshal, which was Andrew Henderson. The fire marshal's job was to light the street lights every night, check for fires, look for fire hazards, and organize the fire attack of the citizens, who were the ones that were actually putting out the fires. The village bought ladder hooks, and a 500-pound bell to summon the resident to form bucket brigades. And in the early days, too, the bucket brigades, it wasn't just the men, it was also the women and the children. The men would usually form the line with the full buckets, and the women and children would take the empty buckets back to the start of the line and continue that way. The people in the town had an interest in it. They didn't want things to burn down. They wanted things to be protected, so they continued on with that. As the town continued to grow, they then also decided to also purchase some hose carts, which would be a hose cart similar to this. The fire bell, the original fire bell that the city had at this date, is actually located in Union at the county museum. That fire bell is still there with a plaque on there and says that it's the original fire bell purchased in Crystal Lake by the citizens that donated money and purchased that bell to put up there. One of the problems with the bell, though, was when there was a storm that came through, which caused a lot of fires back then from lightning strikes, was that when the bell rung and it was during a thunderstorm, they could only hear it for 2 blocks, so nobody really knew that there was something going on, including the fire marshal, who lived farther than 2 blocks. So a lot of times they had to send someone over there and actually knock on his door and wake him up if it was in the middle of the night and let him know that there was a fire. And we also have to remember that as time starts going, that these were people that lived in the town. They're the ones who formed the fire department and had an interest in everything else in it, okay? There is an article that dates back in 1901. A new hose cart was purchased, and allegedly got off to a somewhat embarrassing start. Soon after the rig was assembled, a fire call came in, and the men swung open the doors and prepared to pull the cart into action. But the opening was too narrow, and in spite of some heroic language, the cart never made it to the fire. So these hose carts would look like this. It's got two arms on there. The hose is wrapped up on the coil there, on the left-hand side there. And, yeah. So this would be the fire hose right here. At that time, most of the hose is what we call 2.5 inches, 2.5-inch diameter hose. And then right here would be the nozzle. So the firemen would pull on these arms here. They'd pull it to the location when they got close. The fire hose is wrapped on here where they would stop either at the fire, depending on which way they had it, and then they would take that hose cart back to the fire. They'd grab that nozzle off too, hook up the nozzle to it. When they got to the hydrant, they'd hook the other end of the hose up to there, just kind of like how we do our garden hoses at home. And they would open up the hydrant, and they would get water onto the fire. Okay? Some of the carts had 2 or 3 nozzles, depending on how much hose, they could do this over and over again. And at this time, around 1901, when they bought this other hose cart, they actually had a couple hose carts already. Okay? As the area grew, the village of Nunde decided to build a village hall. The village hall was built at the corner of Main Street and Beardsley Street. This also served as a police and fire station where the hose cart and other fire equipment were stored. On June 6th of 1908, the village of Nunde voted to change their name to North Crystal Lake, and that had taken over a series of time of where they were trying to put the two towns together. When we look back into history and we look back at newspaper articles and some of the minutes from the city council minutes back then, we realize that the two towns were really in one. Nunde was the area up here around the railroad tracks on both sides, Main Street, William Street, and all that. And the village, or I guess wouldn't even be a village at that time, or village of Crystal Lake was actually in the area of Route 14 by the park there between Pearson and McHenry Avenue. That section in there was where Crystal Lake actually got started. Okay? The two separate, they would continue to buy, both towns would continue to buy additional equipment to handle the fires. Each town did have a fire marshal, although we don't read much or hear much about the actual town of Crystal Lake. Most of the information that we get in the beginning is actually from the village of Nunde. Okay? During the time period, it was common for the two villages to help each other out during fires. The two villages also discussed and agreed to connect the water system together and install fire hydrants. It was also standard practice to make a call to TC Industries, whose employees would bring up a fire engine that they had. It was called the AT&C, to the village. Such as the case was on April 25th, 1912, when the engine made the run from Terracotta to Crystal Lake in record time for 3 barns that were on fire on Ellsworth Street. So the first actually motorized engine in the area was actually owned by TC Industry, which is at the bottom of Route 31. And they had a large complex there. Of course, a large industry being out in the middle of nowhere, the big concern was to protect that. So it was real common for surrounding towns to put a phone call in down there to TC Industry, and the employees would get on the engine and make the drive up to where it was at Crystal Lake. And if you look back at the newspaper back then, they would actually list the men that responded back. They'd have their full names in there and everything else that they responded to Crystal Lake. And some of the documentations that we have, it was kind of getting pretty common. As this was starting to happen also, was that both villages were realizing how important fire protection is. The newspaper, back then was very opinionated, and they would constantly talk about how both towns need some kind of fire protection. That, what we're doing with just the citizens isn't going to work, that we need to have an organized, we need to find some firemen that would protect the city better. By 1912, the village of Crystal Lake started installing a water system now. Okay? Nunda already had one in place by then. On November 28th, Fire Marshal Woolberg was assisting with a repair of the water main in front of the Hotel Richmond when a fire broke out in the Colby building on William Street. Marshal Woolberg had several lines of hose nearby and had the volunteers quickly pouring water into the building. As the fire continued to burn, Marshal Woolberger contacted Crystal Lake Fire Marshal John Purvey of the sister city, Crystal Lake, that North Crystal Lake is running short of water. Marshal Purvey turned the full force of his water supply into the water mains leading to this village, saving the day in several buildings. So it was pretty common that they would work back and forth even though they were kind of distant. So they would actually on this particular one, because the one town was running out of water, they took fire hoses from one fire hydrant, connected it to fire hydrants in the other water system, opened it up, and supplied the water that way so that the two towns were connected that way. Because of fires and several other fires, the citizens of both villages started questioning if the organized fire department is in order. The Crystal Lake Herald also questioned when the village would buy much needed equipment and organize a fire department. The article goes on to state that the equipment most necessary is a combined hose cart and chemical wagon, an engine not being needed as the water pressure is significant to throw a water stream over any building we have here. In case of fire, anyone within sound of the bell would hop on the wagon and help out for pure love of excitement, if nothing else. So that was an article that was in the Herald trying to promote the city leaders to go ahead and start organizing this fire department based on what everything was going on. But kind of interesting, too, how they were actually telling the city leaders what exactly they should buy. That shouldn't be a motorized engine. We should still stay with the wagon. So even though they were pushing for the city and the villages to go modernize, they were somewhat holding them back by saying, instead of getting a motorized engine, we'll still stick with the guys running down the street pulling the carts. Okay? So they continued to do that with our big fires that we were having. Okay? As time went, the two towns became one. They became the village of Crystal Lake. And in 1913, actually in 1913, in December of 1913, the village of Nunde actually passed an ordinance to organize an organized fire department. Shortly after that, it was either March or April, there was an election held where the two villages finally voted to join the two villages together and just become Crystal Lake. So in 1914, the new village of Crystal Lake took that ordinance that Nunde had put into place and kind of changed it up a little bit and organized the fire department. December, we talked about that. Some of the things that they had on place, that the department was going to consist of a fire marshal, assistant fire marshal, and a secretary, treasurer, and engineer. The superintendent of water works shall be the engineer. The compensation for the members attending drills will be 50 cents per meeting, and they couldn't have more than one meeting per month. Okay. The fire marshal and the engineer shall receive $1 per meeting. Instead of 50 cents, they get $1. And the members would receive $2 apiece for attending fires within the corporate limits or responding to an alarm thereof. So what they did, they put in place is organized it. They gave the fire marshal permission to go ahead and hire some firemen. An article appeared in the paper that they were looking for people to be firemen. 50 guys and 50 men applied for it, and they hired the 12, and this is the original 12. They get 50 cents for a meeting. Even though the city council said they could only get paid one time a month for a meeting, they actually had weekly meetings. They didn't get paid for most of them. They'd only get paid for one a month, and they'd get that 50 cents. But they would meet weekly. They would have a meeting, and then they'd do training, or they'd do training followed by a meeting. So right from the beginning when they organized, the first fire chief realized, or at that time they called him the fire marshal, realized how important it was for them to train, especially with the new vehicles and with the new equipment and all that. So they hired 12 men, and they got $2 for attending a fire within the corporate limits. It was real common back then, especially when these guys first got started. They would get called outside the city. They would go and attack those fires, and they would just come back and clean everything up. It's quite obvious also looking back in city council minutes and also looking at the paper that these gentlemen here got in trouble once in a while for taking the apparatus outside the city limits and putting out fires because as you look at it, the city invested in it, they were investing in them, and they were taking their equipment and going someplace else and putting out fires because someone else would make it a call for it. Also, the ordinance went on to say, which is I think maybe part of our history with when we hear about firemen and policemen, a lot of time it seems like firemen and policemen don't get along. When I first started on the fire department, they were our best friends. And back then, there was an ordinance that said that the police department shall be in attendance at all fires to assist the fire department. So maybe that's where we got that heritage in this town where the police department and fire department work very well together. And it still does that to this today. Okay. In May of 1914, Paul Bartram was appointed the fire marshal of the new village and also of the new formed fire department. He actually got $50 a year to have this position, and it was considered a full-time position. Because not only would he do that, he'd also do all this stuff around the town. They went on also gave him permission to organize the fire department. As I said, put an ad in the paper. He had 50 gentlemen that responded to the ad, and he picked 12 out of that and formed this first fire department. Okay. In July of 1914, the interesting thing behind this fire engine that they're all standing around is that the Crystal Lake buys a motorized fire engine. It was a 1914 Harder chemical engine, a 2-ton truck with a 72 horsepower engine, 80 gallons of chemical tank with 150 feet of chemical hose, and fully loaded with other firefighting equipment for the cost of $3,300. The actual cost of the engine was $4,500. It was built for a town in Wisconsin, and when the company went to go deliver it, the town didn't have the rest of the money. And somehow on the way back through, I don't know if they heard that Crystal Lake was organizing a fire department or if they were just coming down Route 14 back from Wisconsin, stopped in the town, talking to local people, found out they just organized the fire department, offered the engine to the city for the cost of what was the balance of it. And again, a city seeing things forward, trying to get organized, be modernized, and being very aggressive, went ahead and bought this engine. It was called a chemical engine, just to kind of run over it really quick, because it was very controversial back then, was there's a tank on there. And inside that tank is basically soda water, or soda powder and water. And they would mix that up, and then there was some acid when they got to the fire scene that they would drop in there, and it would mix it up and make a chemical that would help put out the fire, similar to what we carry in some of our fire extinguishers. When the acid drops in there, just so you know, it does get neutralized, so you don't have to worry about it being real hazardous. And that's why they had the chemical line also. Then that would go through. Each one of these gentlemen had different assignments on that rig. There was 2 guys that were assigned to the chemical line. There was 2 guys assigned to a regular water line. There was 2 guys assigned to making the hydrant hookup. So when they had fires, and of course the paper, who was very aggressive, saying that the city needs to organize a fire department, they would turn around and criticize the fire department every time they got on a call and whether or not they were doing things right. Okay? So these guys would get there, and what they would do is the first thing that came off was the engineer would mix up the acid in there. There's a handle on there that you crank everything up to get it mixed up. It would create pressure. It would go through the chemical line and attack the fire. At the same time, other firemen were dragging the line back to the hydrant, making the hookup. They would just crack the hydrant open up a little bit so that water got into the hose just a little bit. And then the other guys would pull the other line off in case the chemical didn't put out the fire. Then they would open up the hydrant fully, and then they would open up the line and attack it with just plain old water. So a lot of times they were able to put the fires out with just a chemical unit. And that was it. So, of course, there was always questions about the water system in the city, because when the firemen hooked up their hoses to the hydrant, it didn't fill the hose. So the chief spent a lot of time educating the town that we don't need to charge the hose, because hose back then wasn't designed and didn't last the way it does today. We can have lengths of hose for years. And back then, if they dragged it across the ground, original hose was made out of leather, then it was made out of a single cotton jacket. You can just imagine if you grab, something that's cotton and drag it down a rough road, how long is it going to last before it gets a bunch of holes in it. So sometimes that hose only lasted 1 or 2 calls or 1 or 2 trainings. So they would do things along that line, especially if it's wintertime and cold out. The last thing they want to do is fill the hose up with water, because remember when they got back to the station, they'd have to dry all that hose out so it's ready to go the next time so it wouldn't freeze on them. Okay? On July 21st, 1914, the fire truck responded to its first fire at a farm at the Henry McMillan near Terracotta at 9:40 in the morning. The barn was destroyed, but the town people were impressed with the work of the newly formed fire department. And one of the things that took place back then is they'd actually wait until, because everybody that was on the fire department lived in town and also worked in town. One of the things they had to do is they had to go and get a note from their employer saying that they could be on the fire department, that their employer would let them off during the day so they can respond to the fires. And that went on. When I first started on the fire department, that still existed. And that's so that we could have enough people there. They would basically wait until most of the guys got there before they would take off in the rig. Okay? So as time went, on July 21st of 1914, a new fire truck responded to its first fire at a farm. And of course, it was near Terracotta, which was Terracotta Industries. Again, took the engine and went out of town for their first fire because someone made a call into the city, and they did it. Their first false alarm was actually, they call it as a first false alarm, but their first really live training exercise was on July 27th of 1914 when Fire Marshal Bertram arranged with J.P. Kruger to light a fire in some boxes and barrels at the rear of his store at 7 o'clock p.m. Promptly at 7 o'clock p.m., Mr. Kruger went out and started the stuff on fire, and the fire bells started to ring. The fire truck carried 7 members. The fire truck carried 7 members, and within 1 minute after the alarm, it was on the road. 2 more members were picked up en route, and the remaining 3 arrived in private vehicles shortly after the engine arrived. The run from the fire station to the blaze was 1.5 miles, and 6 minutes from the time the alarm was turned in, the firemen were playing a stream of water. The Crystal Lake Herald at the time printed, "Too much credit cannot be given to the fire." For some reason, the Herald nicknamed them laddies. So too much credit cannot be given to the fire laddies. They did well, and Crystal Lake is proud of the speed and efficiency shown last Thursday night, even if it was only a false alarm. So as they started training and practicing and proving to the people that they were a good organized group, that they knew what they were doing a lot of training and studying and everything else and working hard, the town and the people started recognizing that they had something good going for them. In September of 1914, the first fundraiser for the fire department was held by the fire department to raise money to help start buying equipment. This also would be the start of the annual fundraiser to help supplement the fire department's budget. The fire department budget in 1914 was actually $300. And if I go back to this picture, their first fundraiser was to buy the rubber coats and the helmets that they're wearing there. So that's what they did. They went out through town doing different fundraisers, doing different activities and stuff like that, and they're able to do that. Okay. Then as time started to go, they realized that the bell on top of the water tower to summons the firefighter wasn't working well. The city council decided to improve the notification methods. So in November already of 1914, the city bought an electric siren. The siren, however, did not work that well. It wasn't any better than the bell. Shortly after that, they went and bought a steam whistle, and they mounted it over at the Bowman Dairy Plant, which I believe was in the area of Crystal Lake Avenue and Main Street. Okay, Crystal Lake Avenue, Main Street, there was a dairy plant there, and they put a steam whistle on there because they must have had something that they were in the process of processing the milk and all that. They had steam, and they would use the steam whistle then to summons the fire department. They also got aggressive or got very advanced where they actually connected it to the operator who would take all the phone calls, and the operator was the one who was actually able to notify the firemen through the steam whistle, where when they first put the steam whistle in, someone would have to run over to the plant. And then one of the things they had to also realize was that the workers would go on break when they heard the whistle go off, because that was one of the things that they used to notify the workers or to notify the farmers that it was getting late and they needed to get their milk in for the day. So there's a couple things that it looks like that I come across that they use that steam whistle for different things. So obviously they had one signal just to let them know, the fire department know, that it was a fire call, not just time to get the milk in for the night. That seemed to work very well, and they continued that on for quite a few years. Again, in 1915, our population now is about 2,300 people. In May 1915, the fire department started a fire prevention program by inspecting buildings in the city to prevent fires and to promote life safety. So even as early as that, back to 1950, when they first organized the fire department, the fire chief at the time, Mr. Fire Chief Bertram, or actually he was called a fire marshal, realized how important it was to go around the town and inspect these different stores and factories and buildings that were in the area of northern part of Crystal Lake was more of an industrial area, and the commercial area, where down by 14 at that time was more residential. But realizing how important it is to get out there and do inspections and promote life safety. In February of 1916, as I said, in 1914, they started doing some fundraisers to start getting some extra money. The firemen back then started realizing how good that worked. So in February of 1916, the firemen held their first annual Firemen's Ball. This was to raise money to buy additional equipment. The Firemen's Ball was held every year on Washington's birthday, which no matter what week it fell on. And then as time went on, they started just holding them on a Saturday night. And as time went on with the Firemen's Ball, they would also start to include dinners with them, live bands and everything else. And it became a big, huge community event. When they had them, it was pretty much like everybody in the town would show up there. Everybody knew it. As I said, the population back then was only 2,300. Not a lot compared to our population today. And so everybody pretty much showed up at wherever this place was. They held it at different buildings around the town, different halls and stuff like that. and it was very successful. They were able to raise, over the years, we've raised a lot of monies to put into a lot of accounts and just keep promoting all kinds of stuff. So it was very successful, and it continued on for a long time. The firemen and their wives would organize the event at a local hall, and after they got all done, the proceeds would be used to buy additional equipment or go into pub ed, whatever it needed that whatever they wanted. These dances continued on into the 1990s. We still had firemen balls back into the 1990s. On July 1st, 1960, the city's first false alarm on record came in July when the whistle went off over at the dairy plant. The firemen all went to the fire station. They got on the truck. They waited for someone to come and tell them where to go. They finally took the truck, drove it downtown to down onto William Street, where the operator was located on the second floor of a building there. Went in and asked her why the whistle went off, and she had no clue. After looking into it a little bit, they found out there was a couple men from the telephone company working on some lines, and they're the ones who accidentally set off the steam whistle. In 1919, at the August meeting, Chief Ober instructed the secretary to write to one of the farmers in the community. As time started to go, the city council started putting more and more pressure on the firemen not to respond to calls outside the town because the city is the one that was paying for them. It was a city fire department then, a municipal fire department. So they started putting more and more pressure on them. So the firemen were trying to come up with ways because, as we know that firemen, we like to help. We don't like to sit still. We don't like to stand still. It'd be really hard for any of us to just sit there on one side of the street and say, well, that's going on over on the other side of the street. I'm not going to go over and help. Our nature is just to go and give a hand, and we'll worry about it later on. Do our best that we can to make everything right, but kind of after it happens, we'll take the beating and work it out from there. So they would continue to do that. As they started responding to some of these fires in the rural area, the city started getting more and more on them. So then the firemen also realized that the rural area didn't have any protection. So what they would do is they would still respond to these calls, and they had set up with the city council that they would back charge these farmers or back charge these people who lived in the rural area. So it was pretty common to come across articles or minutes or notes where the fire chief would instruct the secretary of the fire department to write a letter to a farmer about a fire that was at his house, and have that the fees need to be collected because the city could not collect them. And also the firemen would not get paid for those calls until they received the money from the farmer. So they would basically take how many firemen were there. They got paid $2 a call. They'd get some money for the gas, maybe some money for the equipment, and then come up with a price and say, this is how much you owe the fire department. There's nothing in the records that they would just write this letter and ask them. There's really nothing in the records that show that they got paid for them or not. And so that meant that sometimes the firemen would be out there for 3-4 hours on a fire, and they didn't get paid by the hour, is by the call, and they may not get paid for that call at all. And they would just continue on. And still in 1921, the department was still at 12 members. In 1921, they actually answered 12 calls that year. At the year end, they had a total of 12. Meeting training nights continued to run on every Monday night each week. And each week the firefighters would train and then have their meetings. It was not uncommon for other men to train with the firefighters. So other men that lived in the town would train, even though the city granted them permission to have 12 members on the fire department. They usually had like 15 to 20. And they would call those guys auxiliary members. They wouldn't get paid at all. They would just help out with the fire department. They'd help out on fires. And basically what they'd do is they'd wait until a fireman retired or left the department, and then the fire department would pick one of those auxiliary members to replace that spot so they could be on the city roster as one of the members of the Crystal Lake Fire Department. The auxiliary members were used a lot during big fires and everything else. We do find records where they would pay the auxiliary members. On some of the larger fires, the city would go ahead and pay them anyways, but they wouldn't really recognize them as an official member of the fire department. Okay? So that went on for quite a while. April 24th of 1924, the second fire engine was purchased by the city for $9,000. It was a 600-gallon per minute Stutz pumper, what we call a triple combination fire truck. This was engine number 2. We know that this engine was still around in 1949. Where it went from there, we're not sure. Then it was kind of interesting because as the town started growing, they bought this new engine in 24 as the hardware was starting to get worn out and it wasn't as effective anymore. The city bought a fire engine in 1924. Then 1925, a Model T fire engine was purchased and equipped with a chemical tank, hose, ladders, and all the equipment. This vehicle was then engine number 3. And at this point, then, the 1940 Harder was put into retirement. But we do find records over the years after that it was kept at one point. It was kept on the gas station, at the gas station here on Woodstock Street. And it was kept in somebody's barn for a while. And the city was paying $5 a month to store this fire engine. And when one of the other two engines needed service or something went wrong with it, or if they had a large fire, someone would go and bring that third engine back out, and they would continue to use it to have like a reserve engine in place. So when we look into the 1925, we actually had 3 fire engines, and they just started numbering them in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we actually had done that all the way up into the 70s and the early part of the 80s, that we just keep numbering them in sequence before we started to use the same numbers over and over. In September of 25, an article appeared in the Crystal Lake Herald from the fire marshal, asking the citizens to not follow the fire engines to calls. When the whistle sounds, roads have been blocked by seekers waiting for the fire trucks to leave the station and then follow the fire trucks to the calls. Also, do not call the operator asking where the fire is. This delay, because of this, it's delaying the firemen who are calling in for the same information. Because of this, the firefighters will now use a code so that the operator will only give the information to the firefighters. So as the town grew, more and more fires were starting to happen, and people get more interested in what was going on with the sirens or with the and understanding what was going on. They would also call the operator and ask for the same information. So they had to start to use some codes and stuff like that, getting the street blocks along that line. So it kind of makes it kind of interesting that they were dealing with that all the way back in 1925. One of the records we do have is that we know that the firemen had a little bit of first aid training, not much. We're not sure what it was, but we do know that they did have, they call it something different, but make it simple, CPR training. There was a fireman back in 1926 who was picnicking out on Crystal Lake with his family. When a boat overturned on the lake, he swam out there. He was able to pull all 3 people in the boat out of the water back to shore, started CPR on the one, and that lady survived. The other 2 gentlemen in the boat did not. So we know that they had training in CPR and stuff like that all the way back then. He was recognized for that, for his heroic efforts by the whole city. He's actually the first firefighter that we have in history that was recognized and given a special award as a firefighter for doing something beyond the call of duty. The fire department was always looking for ways to raise additional funds, such as conducting the annual dances, helping out different events throughout the city, which we'll get into a little bit. One of the other things they started to do was what they call their annual poultry raffle. It was always held around Thanksgiving, and in 1927, the department did a 3-day event and raised $944, which is a lot of money when you think back then. Okay? So they would take this money and turn around and put it right back into their budget or into their funding to buy additional equipment, whatever they needed for the fire department to fix it up, to help supplement the city budget so that they could keep going forward, keep buying good equipment and all that. During the 1920s, the city would approve each year for 2 firefighters also to attend the annual Firemen's Convention, which at that time was held in Quincy, Illinois. Eventually would move to Champaign, Illinois. It's a large training operation that would take place. The city, again, would give permission for 2 firefighters to go there. They would give monies for the firefighters to go there to help defray their costs. And we do have records in 1940 that it would cost the city $25 to send 2 firefighters down to Champaign, Illinois for a week and get a week's worth of training. The firefighters would come back to Crystal Lake then, and they would train the other members of the department of some of the new tactics, new equipment, or whatever was out there based on lessons learned. Even as far as fire prevention stuff, what to look for to make sure buildings are safer, exits blocked, all that kind of stuff. So that became very important. Again, it shows how much the city council and the people back in the early days realized how important fire protection was to the city, that we have to keep going forward, we have to keep support it and make sure it's a good department. During the 1920s also, the city would send bills to owners of buildings
who summons the fire department for fires outside the city limits. So now the city's starting to get involved with this because it's their men and their equipment that's going outside of town. They started to realize that we got to get involved with this and start getting some of our money back. The firemen would not get paid until the payments were received, and they would constantly send bills out to these different fires. Some of them were as high as $75, depending on how long the firemen were out there and how much equipment was, and some of it was as low as $30. In 1929, the fire department in 1929, the city council also started getting a little more aggressive, looking for other ways to generate money or get money to help support the fire department so that the fire department would have its own budget. And the city realized that they could receive payment from the insurance tax. So in 1929, they passed the ordinance to receive the 2%, and the amount that they got back then was $455 to help supplement the fire department budget. In July of 1929, the old Model T was traded in for a Chevrolet chassis engine, which was engine number 4. The 300-gallon pumper with a 100-gallon booster tank had 200 feet of hose on it with ladders, hand extinguishers, and other minor equipment. This truck was paid for by the fire department itself, not the city, but by the fire department themselves with all the money that they raised over the years with their fundraisers. It actually cost them, because they traded in the Model T, so they worked it out with the city council that they could trade in the Model C. It actually cost the firemen $4,200 to have this. By having this, we are now looked at, the City of Crystal Lake Fire Department was now looked at one of the best equipped fire departments in the area because of the equipment we had and the modernized of it. In 1929, the fire department decided to meet with the local farmers, asking them to pay $5 a year for fire service. So they started realizing how important it was to start reaching out more than just the city. And the city council at that time also was looking at things around just the city limits as far as going out to a mile and a half of what was developing out there, because they knew that eventually as the town keeps growing that at some time they would be involved with those areas. So they went out and talked to all the farmers and said, for $5 a year, if you have a fire, we'll come out there and you'll be covered that way. It's kind of like a subscription. And you'll be covered insurance that way, and you won't get charged that $50 or $75. There's not much evidence shows how many farmers decided to do this, or if any firefighters did not, but it shows that the fire department was starting to work on forming a rural district. Okay? Also because of this, in 1930, the fire department will charge, they started looking at it more, and in 1930, they decided just to start charging a $50 flat rate for fire service used outside the city limits. Okay. They also created a fire tax in 1930, which they put on the ballots, and the city, after seeing the fire department, the organization of it, how well it was working, they went ahead and passed it. The town had no problem passing it at all, so they could create a fire tax and generate more money for the fire department so it would get better equipped. The other thing that took place, as I said, we have some evidence that there was some first aid going on with the fire department. In 1930, the city council actually approved to purchase a pulmonary resuscitator. A pulmonary resuscitator that the fire department would carry on one of the rigs, and that meant that they were starting to respond to EMS calls. A pulmonary resuscitator was a device that had oxygen with it that you'd put on a person's face. For the most part, press a button, it would pressurize or push air into the lungs to help a person breathe. So they were starting to respond in those kind of emergencies back in 1930, even though they were just a bunch of firemen. Okay. They continued on. As time went, they realized how valuable this was, and also this is where the Crystal Lake Park District starts getting involved with the fire department also. And in 1932, the Crystal Lake Park District, together with the city council, decided to purchase a more modernized pulmonary recessor. So the two of them went together, and they each it cost $200, or it cost $400 for a new one. So the city council gave $200, the park district gave $200, and they bought a brand new one and placed it on the rigs that way. So it's starting to, some of the other areas starting to get in on it to help out and buy some of this equipment that was much needed. They also started having to purchase, coming across the purchase of some things. We found out that in 1930 that the council approved to buy 4 coats for $7 each and 2 pairs of boots for $4.50. Just so you understand right now, if we wanted to outfit a new firefighter, it's just without the turnout, the coats, the helmet, the pants and the boots, and a pair of gloves, we're probably talking more around $1,000. So just for a coat and a boot, we got something going on, or we're good?
There's a big accident around 14 in Dewey.
Okay.
Second alarm.
Okay. All right. So some of the other parts of the community were starting to, help pitch out and all that. 1931, several men of the Hampshire Fire Department were guests of the evening attending our practice and meetings. They were very much impressed with our quick action in regards to the hose and nozzle connections. Also, they were impressed with the manner in which the meeting was held. It was not uncommon that other fire departments would come to Crystal Lake and train. Because of the knowledge and the equipment that we had, we were so modernized, and the efficiency that they were at, proving themselves at fires after fires, being called. They were starting to get called all over the county. We have records that show back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that it was not uncommon for the Crystal Lake Fire Department to be summoned all the way out towards Marengo, up to McHenry, out to Woodstock, wherever it was, and more of the rural areas, not the towns, but the rural areas of that they would put a call in. And some of the articles would even state that a call was made into the Woodstock Fire Department and they wouldn't go. So a call was made into the Crystal Lake Fire Department, and then they would tell the gentleman that took out with their 2 engines or whatever it might be and responded to and went out there and helped out. Most of the time, by the time they got there, it was pretty well gone. But just the people were impressed that they would actually go out there and try and do whatever they could. Okay? So it was real common for other fire departments from Hampshire. We got county departments over in Lake County that used to come on meeting nights with Crystal Lake and would train right alongside with them and learn what they were doing. And on the other hand, so a lot of times those firemen would be doing the same thing. They'd had some kind of a call or they came across something, and they would teach the Crystal Lake firemen the same thing. As I said earlier, the City Council approved for a couple firefighters to go down to Champaign every year. It started to become where the Crystal Lake firemen were starting to lead some of those trainings down there because of their experience and their knowledge and their hard work. So they became known very well throughout the whole state as one of the better departments around. In 1932, there's a very large fire that happened at the Oddfellows Lodge. It was located somewhere between, I believe, from what I can find out, it's between Railroad Street and Woodstock Street. It was in December, very cold out. Conditions were very bad. So the 12 fire at this time we're still at 12 firemen. The 12 firemen were fighting the fire for several hours, and this is again one of those cases where we find where the city hired 12 more men of the town to come over and help the firemen out so that they could rotate in and out to keep warm. And this is where the wives started to organize some stuff. They would bring dry clothes to the guys. So the guys would go into some other building to warm up, whatever it is, and their wives would come with a set of clothes, and they'd take those clothes that were all wet and icy and everything else back home, probably wash them and start getting them dry, and then they kept bringing more dry clothes for them. And that's going to get very important as time goes on the whole structure of the fire department and develop the way everything went. So it was really, like I said, it wasn't that uncommon for them to hire additional people to help out. As I said, it was real common for other fire departments to come and train. When we go back all the way to 1933, the chief at the time helped organize what we call the County Firemen's Association. The association would meet at different towns each month to meet, see what the other departments had for equipment, how they trained, and how they could help each other out at large fires. That happened in June of 1933. They started organizing it. The very first meeting of the McHenry County Firemen's Association was held at Crystal Lake in August, as they were the host of it, and it would be something similar to this, okay, where the different department members would show up. And it also worked out a real nice thing because when I first started, this organization still existed, and we basically knew everybody in the county. You pull up on a fire, it was like a big family reunion. You knew everybody that was there from attending these meetings. And it was their very knowledgeable stuff. A lot of times there was outside instructors that would come in, maybe from the state of Illinois, maybe someone from the city of Chicago, the insurance company, whatever it is. They would come in and help teach some of this stuff so that we became a better. And this is where we start working as a group as far as countywide. In 1933, the city council signed an agreement with the town of Woodstock and the Cary Fire Department for interchange help when needed for large fires. This is where we start to get what we call mutual aid coming in, where if a town has a fire, we can go there automatically. So they actually came up with an agreement that the three towns would work together. When one town would have a big fire, the other towns would automatically send some equipment over that way. All they had to do was make a phone call. Okay. Also in May, the Crystal Lake Fire Department responded to and because of this, that happened in 1933. In May, the Crystal Lake Fire Department responded to a fire in Cary, which was a structure at Route 14 in Borden Street. It was a large building, 40 by 120 feet long, and ended up being a total loss, and it was an old pickle factory. In 1934, also, the steam whistle was replaced as the Bowman Dairy Plant started going out of business. It wasn't efficient anymore. They put in a modern electric fire siren that actually was mounted on top of the old City Hall right there at Beardsley Street and Main Street. And we had electric fire whistles up on top of that building into the early 90s. I don't remember exactly when we stopped using whistles, but I know they were still going into the 80s for sure, and I thought it was into the 90s also. After the whistles, or towards the end of the whistles, we started going to what we call pagers. The original ones, I believe, were called page boys that the firefighters would carry. The first ones would just go off. The firefighters would go down to the fire station. There's a couple different ways that they would get the calls. One way was when the original station was closed, is that they turned that into the police department. They sealed up the 2 doors, made that the police department. The dispatcher was right there. And I've been told one of the things they used to do is take a chalkboard and write the address and the type of call on the chalkboard, and they would put it in the window. And when the firemen came around the corner, they'd take a look at the window, and they would see where the call was, and then go into the fire station and take the equipment and head out. Okay. Then we started getting into voice-activated pagers, where our pagers would go off. They would tell us what kind of call it is, where the call was at. And now with modern time today, it's portable radios that notify us over the radios, and then also now using cellular phones that we get the notification, which was just going on here a couple minutes ago. So I apologize for that. So as time goes, we've modernized very well. Okay. So the steam whistle was replaced, going to electric. Also in December of 1934, at this time the fire department was still at 12 members, right? Now answering 26 calls. And the 26 calls are ones that they would actually document as a call. They went on more calls, but if they went out on a call and it was a small fire, like a garbage can fire or something little, and they didn't use too much, they didn't really document it. They just kind of, no big deal. It's just a small fire, So they didn't always record them. The 26 calls would be fires where they were there like probably for an hour, using a lot of water, a lot of time, and everything else. Okay, and the operation cost in 1934 that we came across was $1,570. Okay. At this time, also in 1934, the firemen got a nice raise. The city council decided that because of their efficiency and efforts and all that we should go from $2 a call to $3 a call. So you got to imagine back then getting that kind of a raise. They were a bunch of happy guys and doing what they loved, so it would just helped out a little bit more. Okay. In 1935, the firefighters raised money, continued to raise money, and buy dress uniforms. The purchase of the dress uniforms was for the upcoming celebration of the city's settlement. In 1936, the city was going to celebrate 100 years of when the first settlers settled in the Crystal Lake area. So the firemen went out and bought dress uniforms. Now, as I told you, there was only 12 members on the department, but there's 13 people in this picture. The one guy in the plain suit, second to the right in the back row, was one of those auxiliary members. So he was the auxiliary member at the time, and when you look at this photo on the back, that's exactly how they have him listed as an auxiliary member. They knew the celebration was coming up, so they went out and bought dress uniforms, paid out of their own pockets and through the fundraisers that they did, and bought the uniforms. The cost to outfit all 12 men in a dress uniform, was with the hats, the coats, the pants, was $341. They supplied their own shoes, and we have another picture of this that didn't quite come out so well, where one of the men, and it's the same firefighter Musket who had saved the people out of the lake, actually has a pair of white shoes on instead of the black shoes. So also, if you notice that the two gentlemen sitting down low in the center, they have more buttons on their coats. That's the chief and the assistant chief. Okay? And again, they had made the assistant chief, who was also the engineer, was also in charge of the water system. So that was a rule the city council placed back in 1914 when the fire department first organized, that whoever was going to be in charge of the water system in the town had to be the engineer of the engine, because he would know what part of town water was good at, what part of town the water wasn't so good at, how to hook up to the hydrants. And we have to be careful even today with our equipment that we can pump more water out of a water main than what it can give us. And if we do that, we create a negative pressure. It's kind of like drinking out of a straw. It'll collapse. So it's a very touchy, balanced situation that we have to have on. We need to get a lot of water there. We have to watch what we're doing. So people that now drive the fire engines and pump on the fires are still called engineer, but there's a separate class that they go through on just on the science and the math of how to be an engineer so we don't break water mains and we don't have that kind of situation to take place. Okay. During the 1930s and 40s, the council would help pay for the firemen, again, to continue to attend the state fire classes. And also they started also help paying the firemen to go to national tournaments for training and firemen state conventions each year. 2 members were picked. They would always rotate the members. It wasn't always the same guys. They would constantly rotate so everybody got hands experience. All the firemen had the same type of training at the same level so that no matter what took place, any firefighter could do that particular operation that needed to be done. And when they first started in 1914, they were assigned certain assignments. But as time went on, they realized that if a guy's sick or something like that, we can't jeopardize the whole operation. So the training started to become universal, where everybody was trained in everything. During the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was common for the members of the fire department to perform other jobs around the city. They had an interest in the town. This is where they were born and raised and grew up. They had pride of who they were. They were very proud to be firemen. They were very proud to live in the city of Crystal Lake. The city of Crystal Lake with its council and with the fire department, its police department, everything you look at the history of the city is just a very proud group of people. So they would help out with other things throughout the city. It was real common for the fire chief to go over and inspect the water tower and say, yep, they're still good. Okay? Sometimes there's actually records where they would drain the water towers and the firemen would go over there and clean out the inside of the water towers. And then they would get paid for this. Most of that money turned around and they put it right back into the fire department fund. So that was real common. So it'd be fixing or installing fire hydrants and painting the fire hydrants. The members would also inspect the water tower and repair it when it needed it. Some of the money that they earned, they'd turn around and put it back in the fire department equipment fund. They would also do standbys at homecoming parades, bonfires, and other type of details. They'd also go around and help shovel out hydrants, which we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Homecoming parades, bonfires, and not sure when it all started, but we also know that the fire department also started going around town and picking up Christmas trees after Christmas. Back then, everybody had live fire trees, had live pine trees for Christmas trees. So after Christmas, they would put them out on the curb. The fire department would come through in their own pickup trucks, and they would load them up. And I believe the city employees would help out somewhat, but it's mainly the fire department. They'd load them up, take them someplace, and they'd light them on fire. And it sounds like it became a big town event where everybody would show up and watch this big fire burn, and the firemen would stand there with all the fire engines and their coats on, stuff like that, and make sure it didn't get out of hand, and they would burn the trees to get rid of it that way. That actually continued on, and at some point the JCs got involved with it, and the fire department then supported JCs on it, and then now we know that the city takes care of it, and they, instead of burning them, we now shred them, grind them, and we recycle them that way. Okay? So it was real common for those guys to do that kind of stuff and help out in the community. Over the years, the JC started, as I talked about that. Also, we find numerous times when the firemen were hired as special police officers at special events, such as when carnivals or circuses came into town, when they had street dances, or events at the high school field house. And I remember when I was a kid going to the field house and seeing the Harlem Globetrotters. And there was firemen standing nearby as part of the security or part of the help out and stuff like that. And the big one that really kind of boggles my mind is that when it came to October, it was like the entire fire department was deputized as police officers for the night of Halloween. So I'm not really sure what that says about the town when it came to Halloween, what we were doing, that we needed 12 more people to be part of the police department to protect everything. But that was real common for them to do other stuff. Each year, the fire department would purchase between 500 and 1,000 feet of hose, 1.5 or 2.5-inch fire hose. With the number of fires and training drills that would take place, the hose would not last long at all. In 1930, the fire department bought 300 feet of 2.5-inch hose. It cost them $1.15 per foot. So they've spent about $345 right there alone for that one purchase. May 1938, the City of Crystal Lake Fire Department was singled out by the state for its widely known efficiency. A delegate from the fire department will be a guest speaker at the annual State Fire Marshal School. Northwest Herald put, the Crystal Lake Fire Department is known far and wide as one of the most efficient volunteer groups in the country. In 1937, fire loss in Crystal Lake was 3,763, a very low figure. And they keep using the term volunteer fire department, but as we know, it was really a paid-on-call fire department right from the start. But it was still considered volunteer because they really didn't get paid for everything they did. Fires continued to burn, and the firemen performed well, such as the fire at 38 McHenry Avenue on February 2nd, 1939. The fire started in the furnace and extended into the walls of the corner of the house. The Herald put, the fire was hard to extinguish. The smoke was so dense that firemen suffered a great deal in going into the smoke-filled room. And remember, this is before we had air packs that we put on our backs, so they would have nothing on at all. Several hours were required to extinguish the fire. Onlookers freely expressed the opinion that the house would not be saved. Chief George Cross and the members of the fire department are to be highly congratulated for the way they handled their stubborn fire. So as time went, people started realizing how well they had and what we had in the way of a fire department. We know that in 1939 there was a fire at the Crystal Lake Country Club. This is one of the first recorded times that we have where the firemen actually had to go and rescue somebody out of a building off of ladders. So there was a fire there that took place, and they got praise for that one also. They continued on also into the 1940s, the first time we have evidence that the fire department was using what we call iron lungs. So in 1940s, when we start to get in what they call iron lungs, or where the firefighters would wear something on their face to protect them against the smoke and heat, more against the smoke. Okay. Also, we know that in 1940 that the fire department bought a new fire engine. It would have brought them back up to 3 engines. They got rid of the Chevy truck, and they had a third fire engine. Again, using their iron lungs in 1941. This was kind of interesting. 1941, the fire chief Cross was also elected as mayor. And there was big questions on whether or not he could wear both hats. And right away he pointed out that for years the city council has insisted that the assistant chief wears 2 hats as far as being in charge of the water system and also being fire chief. But shortly after that he realized that maybe I should do something different, so he did point someone else as chief, but he still stayed on as a member of the fire department. It's kind of that once you have it in your blood, it's hard to get rid of. Okay. Because of the high use of fire hose for fires and all that, training drills, the fire department also decided to do something else. Because they were buying so much hose, they found out that they could buy what's called an expander. It cost them $67, and they could repair all this fire hose. Most of the time when the hose got a hole in it, they would throw it away or get rid of it. Now with this, they could take the ends of the hose and couple it. They would be a little bit shorter, and they could fix the hose that way and get service out of the hose a lot longer, which was very important for the fire department budget overall and keep them going forward. In 1946, the fire department approached the city council and asked if they could raise the number of people on the fire department. This is the first time since 1914 when they organized that they were asking to have more people. The city council granted them 2 more people. So they went from 12 firefighters to 14. All right. And then also, at that same time, the city council then decided to raise their pay for meetings from 50 cents a month, or 50 cents a meeting, to $1. But they could still only do 1 meeting a month. Even though they met every week and trained every week, they only got $1 for the month. Obviously, they were very happy with that. 1947, the council gives the fire department permission to write specifications for a new fire truck. Council approved Seagrave Corporation of Columbus, Ohio as a low bidder, and the fire department members were very pleased with this. They handed the city council check for $4,000 to be placed into the fire department equipment fund, which helped pay for the fire engine. The total cost of this fire engine was $14,744. So, and they finally got it in 1949. So now we start to see the cost of everything starting to change. In September of 1950, this was a big change also. as I said, as things continued on, in September of 1950, the firemen's wives organized a firemen's auxiliary to assist the firemen in making money for a building of their own, to help fire victims, make coffee and sandwiches for the firefighters at fires. The women would volunteer their time on a rotating basis. Most of the time, the women would not receive pay or monies for the food that they served at different fires. So the women of the fire department started to organize, because they were, like I said, a lot of times they were bringing food to them or bringing fresh clothes to them and everything else. So they started actually organizing and found out about this through another fire department. They actually went to the state and got certified through the state as a nonprofit organization. And they would supply all kinds of stuff. They'd have fundraisers. They would do bake sales, all kinds of stuff, just all kinds of fundraisers. When the poultry raffle took place every year, they'd bake a bunch of cookies and a bunch of cakes and all that, and they would sell them there. And the proceeds would turn around, go into their group. And they were a little more stricter than the firemen were. If they had to pay 50 cents dues each month for their meeting. And if they didn't make the meeting, they had to pay the 50 cents as a penalty for not being at that meeting. And they would rotate through, usually 2 or 3 women were part of, on a rotating basis, what they called the kitchen crew. And when the fire whistle would go off, they'd go down to the station. I don't know how they figured it out or worked it out, but they would make coffee. A lot of times it sounds like they took food from their own houses, bread, lunch meat, stuff like that, make sandwiches, go out to the fire, and while the firemen were fighting the fire, they would feed them. Now, according to one of the women that were on the auxiliary, I was told this could also be viewed as the wives of the firemen wondering just what do they do at the fire station. So they would help out, and they were a great help. When I started on the fire department, I got exposed to them. They were just absolutely great. They were like almost a second mother to us, constantly taking care of us, just making sure everything was wonderful. And the first time I got my experience with them was when we had the fire downtown Crystal Lake, which was the Crystal Lake hardware store, the Ace. And I believe that's the last time they actually served a meal for the fire department. It was a long fire. We were there overnight. We had at the time the fire department had a van, and I remember the van pulling down the street, and all these guys got out, and they had these big smiles on their face, and they said, "Chris, it's your turn." And I didn't know what was going on. I just got in the van with this group of guys, and they took us back to the fire station. We walked in the fire station. You could smell the food. We went downstairs. It was the biggest breakfast buffet I'd seen in a long time, and they had eggs and bacon and sausages, a whole shot, toast and everything else, hot coffee, juices and everything else, and you filled up your belly, and then it was time to go back. So I knew why those guys had a big smile on their face. They had a full belly, and we knew we had a little to go on. So just a great group of women that would do all kinds of fundraisers and bought a lot of equipment to help supplement the budget. They helped, I believe, the first hearse tool. They had a big involvement with that, which is what we use to tear apart cars and all that. They're sitting in front of this. This is what we call a porta power that they had bought. That was before the hearse tools came out, so we'd get cars open or even force doors open. You'd put it in there. It's a hydraulic pump. It would open up. They bought a lot of respirators. They bought the first air packs for the fire department, from what I can find. So they were very aggressive with it, and they would also help out a lot. They would also do other fundraisers that they would get paid. As I said, there was the McHenry County Firemen's Auxiliary meetings that would take place, and these women would get hired. They'd even get hired by other fire departments. They'd even get hired by the police department or the city council when they had special events going on to come in and serve and cook the food, and they would get paid for it. And they would turn around, take that money, and dump it right back into their budget to buy more equipment for the city. So just outstanding. Just shows you how much these people just love their community and how dedicated they were. So they formed that. It was also real common after they formed it, because they were so successful. Again, just like the firemen, constantly having other fire departments come in here and training with the firemen. Women from other fire departments would come with their chiefs sometimes, and their chief would show them what the Women's Auxiliary was all about, and to get the same thing going in their own town. Okay. 1952. Again, the members of the fire department were very proud of their community and wanted to be involved in their community. In 1952, the city, there was people in the town who decided to organize a Little League team, or a Little League, what am I thinking of? Not a Little League team, but a Little League, league, yeah, thank you. Drawing a blank there. Form a Little League, And one of the original sponsors was the Crystal Lake Fire Department. And we know that when they hit 50th year, that it was just the Crystal Lake Fire Department, and I believe Frank Hobby Shop was the only two that still sponsored the original Little League teams. And I believe we still do it to this day, that we still donate, that the Crystal Lake Fire Rescue Association donates to the Little Leaguers to keep it going and all that. So that was very proud. And we also know that after they sponsored them, when this all got started in 1952, that the city championship for 52 was the Crystal Lake Fire Department. They also got the championship in 53, and most of these boys were firemen's sons, and they also got the championship in 55. So they were very proud of that, and we have continued that tradition of staying involved with the community, of having children raise up in the right direction and in organizations. July of 1955, members of the fire department approached the council asking to increase the size of the fire department. Okay? So again, now in 1955, they go to it. The kind of interesting thing about this is the city council gave them permission to have 14 people earlier. Well, when they asked to go and get 5 additional, or increase it, the city council agreed to have 5 members. So they went from 20 to 25. So I don't know if the fire department pulled the wool over on the city council and said, yeah, we got 20 members now, we're going to add 5 more on, and we'll be up to 25. Or if somewhere in between they slowly got permission to add on, it was just never documented. It's hard to say. So I'm sure they got permission. In 1955, plans for a new fire station was presented to the council. In 1956, a new fire station was built at 119 Beardsley Street, next to the original fire station behind the City Hall, at a cost of between $26,000 to $27,000. The cost of this fire station is going to be split 50-50. The city council paid for half of it, and the firemen and the women's auxiliary paid for the other half. Okay? This station opened up in 1956, and they held that year's poultry raffle was to be held at the new fire station. So that's the fire station we're looking at with the equipment that they had. This was later than that date, but that would be the fire station right there. The original fire station is in that building, which was the original City Hall. And if you look on top of the roof, you actually see the electric siren that we had to notify the firefighters of when there was a fire. So, and there's a couple guys in this room that probably rode on those rigs. Right? So that's kind of cool, too. On July of 1957, a large thunderstorm struck the area, and the firemen would assist with using the engines to pump out different parts of the city, to including Rosenthal Lumber Yard on Woodstock Street. So again, they weren't just fighting fires, and we can find more and more evidence of them going out on fire calls, but again, they continue to help the city out, whether it was shoveling snow, after a storm, helping picking up branches, cutting trees out of the way, whatever it might be. They did what they had to do to help out. We know that in 1958 that the members of the fire department were 23, and that the budget at this time was $3,617. Not sure when it all started, but we also know at 1958 the fire department started to do open houses and do fire prevention stuff. This was primarily held during the month of October, when it's Fire Prevention Week. And some of the things that they would do is go out to the schools and do the fire drills. Okay. Throughout the 60s and 70s and the 80s, the Firemen's Auxiliaries continued to grow. Their importance to provide warm clothes, sandwiches, and coffee for the firemen at fires was very much needed and appreciated. They would also continue to have fundraisers for funding the purchase of equipment such as electric fans for venting a house, water coolers and coffee pots, speakers to mount on the sides of the fire trucks so that they could hear the radio traffic, badges for the firemen, resuscitators, and self-contained breathing apparatus and other much-needed equipment that the firemen would ask for. So they would go to the firemen each year and say, what kind of equipment you need? And they would tell them, and they would start looking at how much it would cost and find a way to purchase that equipment through different ways. Sometimes it's even doing quilts, making large quilts and selling those as fundraisers. Several dinners at the county firemen's meeting that the women served at and got paid for, and again, they put that money right back into their funds for buying stuff. Okay? We know that... We know that 1963 is the first time that they really changed the name from the Firemen's Auxiliary to the Women's Auxiliary. And they also bought themselves little badges. They were very proud of who they were. And they actually went out and bought blue dresses. And any time they were doing a fundraiser or something like that, they were to wear their dresses. If they didn't show up at the meeting with their dresses and their badge on, they got fined 50 cents that they had to put into the kitty, which I think was different than, it maybe had a term called a slush fund. But they had this other kitty that they would have to donate into there, and they would go from there. So they were very important to the whole thing. Most of the time, again, remember, they didn't get paid for their KP duties. They would just take the money out of their own funds and away they go. Okay? As the city grew, so did the volume of calls. The men of the Crystal Lake Fire Department battled several large fires during the 60s. In the city, the Fire Protection District, and the surrounding towns and villages. The need for additional equipment and personnel were very evident. In 1962, the fire department, for the first time, answered over 100 calls for that year. In 1962, they responded to 129 calls. Okay? This is the fire department as it was in 1961. Again, very proud of who they were and also their dress uniforms. In 1963, the Crystal Lake Rural Fire Protection District is formed after elections approved from the residents of the rural area, and contracts were signed with the city for fire protection. So this is where now finally the city has a contract with the people that live in the rural area that formed the district, and now we're going to supply fire service to the people in the district. And at the same time, they would also pay the city for these services. So they worked something out. Okay. In November, the fire department purchased a new equipment truck, which is equipment truck number 10 that you see right here. Very proud of it. It's what we call a large bread truck to carry all the additional rescue equipment that the department was buying. And that's how it was worded, as the rescue equipment. So as we realized that the fire department was getting more and more responding to car accidents, having to open up doors, doing more rescue calls with the respirators and everything else. So they picked up this vehicle here in 1963. We also know that as the departments in the area started developing, helping each other became more and more. And in 1963, the fire department, along with surrounding departments, all responded to Carpentersville for the Meadowdale Shopping Center fire that was like $1 million damage. Okay? And that shopping center is still somewhat there off of Route 25. It's got the water tower they used to call Meadowdale. They lost most of that back in 1963. And because they were overwhelmed, they just started making in phone calls to other areas to ask them if they can respond. Okay? Again, there's that equipment truck up on the left. The fire department now is starting to respond to more car accidents and attend to people that are injured. The equipment that you see down here on the ground in the front was actually purchased by the Women's Auxiliary, the respirators and stuff like that, and attending to the patients. Okay? April 11th, 1965, probably is one of the more bigger days of the history of Crystal Lake, and that's when the tornado struck. Okay. At 3:30 p.m., alarm number 37, all equipment was dispatched when a tornado struck Crystal Lake. 5 people perished, 178 buildings were severely damaged, taxing the city and the fire department. For several weeks after the tornado, the fire department and the Women's Auxiliary would go out on the weekends and help get everything put together as far as the trash and all that, the houses that were destroyed, pile them all up, and they would burn them to get rid of the debris. They would just burn it back then. The Women's Auxiliary not only served food for the firemen, but the Women's Auxiliary were also serving food to the residents that were devastated. That went on until the end of the year. So this happened in April, and the firemen on the weekends would go out and wouldn't get paid for it, but just to go out and help those people that suffered and to get them back onto their feet. Different parts of the town they got hit. In May of 1965, Harold Krecker was appointed as chief of the fire department. The fire department at the time had 3 engines, 1 tender, and 1 equipment truck. And Harold's with us today. In 1966, there was a big push for a new fire station and elevated ladder truck. The insurance company looking at Crystal Lake started to tell them that they need to do something different. They need to get some different equipment because everything was on the north side of the railroad tracks, and the town was growing to the south. So the city council realizes the insurance company is what sets our rates for how much we pay on our premiums and everything else like that. So the city council jumped on it right away, looking at what's going to happen. So they started working on a new municipal complex or a new fire station public safety building. That was the building that was built across the street from here at 121 Woodstock Street. And it was built with two bonds that the city council was able to get. One was for the fire department, or one was for the building, and then another one was an equipment fund for $50,000 so that they could start buying some additional firefighting equipment. The purchase of a new engine and snorkel happened in 1967, paid by the city, but the firemen used monies from fundraisers to help buy the equipment that was carried on the apparatus. So the city secured the funds and all that to build the fire station and build the snorkel truck that you see here. But it was the firemen that continued on with their fundraisers, and the Women's Auxiliary continued on with their fundraisers to take money. And they actually started this also back in like 67 is when the fire department and Women's Auxiliary started having the dances each year, and that money was just dedicated to go to help purchase equipment to put on the snorkel and a new fire engine that they got back then. Okay. On September 23rd, the new public building opened at 121 Woodstock Street, and this now became the new main station, and the station over on Beersley Street became station number 2. Again, the Women's Auxiliary was involved with it, serving food at the open house. That was well attended. In 1968, kind of shows how things started to change. The fire department buys a 4-wheel drive pickup truck and build a fire pump and tank. So it was the men of the fire department that built this tank and built the fire pump and everything else, installed it in the back of the vehicle for grass fires. Okay. In that year, in 1968, in the month of February and March, the fire department, obviously it was very dry, the fire department responded to over 70 grass fires in that 2-month period. Okay. This is such a classic picture, isn't it? You know, a couple of firemen here. This is the large line with the smooth bore. He's just got his regular old hat on. This is the coats that we wear, what we call 3/4-inch coats with the rubber boots. And this guy here, you know, that's pretty much a spitting image of my dad. My dad was a pipe smoker all his life and all the time. But you just look at 3 guys there. The guy in the back just got his boots on. You know, here, and this has got to be one of the chiefs or assistant chief. And I guess, you know, we look at the gloves, too. It's what we call the red ball gloves or the rubber gloves that we'd wear. So just, you know, at that time, they'd have to pull these hoses off the rigs out in these fields. So they realized it. And like I said, for, you know, in a 2-month time, they responded to 70 grass fires in the month of February, March. That would be a real lot. And, of course, as the city continues to grow and gets more active, they had to do some different things. In June of 1969 is when the Crystal Lake Fire Department the city of Crystal Lake made an agreement with McHenry now to do auto aid with them, to assist them at large fires. So we start to see the whole development of the fire department as a whole in the whole area getting larger and larger, needing, as we got more calls and bigger fires, we needed more help, and we couldn't just provide it by our own towns. Okay? So the agreement with McHenry in July of 19 fire department purchased. In July of 1969, the fire department then purchased new coats and boots for all 30 members. So in 1969, we got up to 30 members. To supply all 30 members with new coats and boots, it was only $4,000. Even though $4,000 is a lot of money, as I said earlier, that may get 4 firefighters today because of this type of equipment and the way it's made. So it's a big change in all that. Okay. Also, the City Council was looking into the cost of fire apparatus and firemen responding to rural fires, and they also started to look into providing some kind of an ambulance service in the city. So that's in 1969 that they started realizing that the fire department got busier, that we need to start looking at some kind of an organized ambulance service. We also know that then later in 1969, the mutual aid box alarm system got started, okay? What we abbreviated to as MAVIS. So when you hear in the paper, you see on the news that it was an extra alarm fire and the fire departments came from all over, that's what we call MAVIS, Mutual Aid Box Alarm Agreement. To this day, the fire departments in Illinois and actually fire departments throughout the country use this system where if we have a large incident in Crystal Lake, we pull this box number. It's got a number assigned to it, and depending on what it is, tells the dispatcher exactly what department and what they're supposed to respond with so that we have a good mix of stuff. if we have a fire, we may not need all engines there. It might be a rural fire where we need more water than we need engines. So that's all spelled out on that. And that actually goes back to 1969, and it really got heavily developed in 1972. In August of 1972, the Crystal Lake Emergency Ambulance Service was created. It was started by the City Council looking, as I said earlier, they were looking at some kind of an ambulance service. So in August of 1972, they created the Crystal Lake Emergency Ambulance Service, otherwise known as CLEAS. Prior to this, ambulances would actually respond out of Queerhammer Funeral Home. And from my understanding, this Queerhammer Funeral Home did it about 12 years before the city actually organized the rescue squad that was separate from the fire department. Okay? Ron Mudrick, I think I said that wrong again. Ron Mudrick was appointed the first fire chief of the ambulance service, and he held that position until 1976. We got the opportunity to meet him the other day, and very interesting person. This is kind of a mysterious picture that I came across recently, and I threw it in here because I kind of figured there'd be some people here that might know what that vehicle is. But this picture is actually before CLEAS was developed. It's some kind of a vehicle that says Crystal Lake Fire Department on it, and it just said emergency. It was like a white. Did we transport people with this, or no?
No.
Okay.
No, that we bought that for equipment for the inhalators.
Okay, so it's
for inhalator calls.
okay. So it's set up for inhalator calls, the first aid calls. Instead of taking the big bread truck or the big equipment truck or one of the engines, they just respond to this. So it just shows how aggressive it was, and that was all developing long before we really had documentation at first. So it's nice that we're starting to get some of this cleared up. On March of 19, before we get any farther too, this Suburban back here, this is a truck versus pickup truck accident over by Prairie Street. And this Suburban right here was the very first ambulance that CLEAS bought. They bought it used, and it cost like $2,500 for the ambulance, and they took a couple $1,000s to buy some equipment and put it in there. Okay? So, a pretty nasty accident that caught on fire and everything else. So, kind of a cool picture also. We also know that as time went, especially, we know in 1974 the Firemen's Auxiliary starts to buy some more equipment. They start buying breathing apparatus, which, again, the way the Crystal Lake Fire Department was and the city was, the council members and everything else, was getting very aggressive. So we were one of the first departments in the county or in the area that bought the self-contained breathing apparatus. We also know that they then bought portable or page boys to start alerting the firemen. And also in 1974 was the start of the 911 system for McHenry County. Okay? It was originally called 911, dial 911 on your phone to summons the emergency. But then when we get phone calls asking where do you buy a phone with the number 11 on it, we realized that we have to reword it. So it got reworded as 911. 1974, then the CLEAS buys their second ambulance. And in 1976 is when the city actually hires 2 people to be full-time firefighters. Although I do know that Chief Krecker was a full-time fire chief before that. I'm just not sure exactly when you started full-time as a chief. The gentleman sitting next to Chief Krecker over there is Chief Neville, who actually was one of the first full-time firefighters hired by the city. Him and another guy to get the engines out of the station faster, especially during the day, because it took a little bit longer. Because we're starting to get at a time point where it's harder for people to leave their place of work to respond to calls. Okay, so they would do that. They hired 2 guys. That happened in 76. In 1977, the city obtained grants to build Station 3. Okay, that's one out there behind Nick's Pizza at 844 Virginia Road. That was numbered Station 3. And again, the one at 121 Woodstock Street was Station number 1. And then over on Beardsley Street was Station number 2. But then for a while, we gave Station number 2 over to the Water Department. And we were out in a building, that blue building that's out there by Terracotta and Terracotta for a while. And then we finally got that station back and then eventually closed it completely. In January of 1980 is when the 2 departments joined together. The city design, which also the rescue squad was kind of saying we need to be all in one, especially the chief at the time was saying that the 2 departments really need to be underneath one. It's in a city council meeting where it was brought up they formed the committee, they went in front of the city council, made some recommendations that the rescue squad should be put in underneath the fire department, that the fire chief should be in charge overall for better operations. So in 1980, that's what they did. They joined the two departments together, and that's when it changed from the Crystal Lake Fire Department to the Crystal Lake Fire Rescue Department. Everybody now had to be trained both in firefighting and also in EMS. This also brought in the paramedic service to the town. Additional full-timers were hired. The additional full-timers were hired, they would work during the day. There's a couple different patterns that they went. For the most part, they worked 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. And then at nights and weekends was when the volunteer or the paid-on-call firemen would come in and man the equipment and the stations. Also in 1980 was the time that we finally had women in the fire service. And this is Lieutenant Joyce Stevenson, who actually went through the process of the classes becoming a firefighter also. She was a paramedic that started with Cleese. And before 1980, before the two departments joined together, I don't believe there was any women on the fire department. It didn't happen until the two joined together. And then we had quite a few. And we still have quite a few full-time female firefighters on the department still to this day. And everybody also knows Joyce as, the local kindergarten teacher throughout the town. So it's always kind of cool to go out on the call and people are, yeah, she's been outstanding and all that. And couldn't figure a better person to put up here for this. So thank you everything you did for us, Joyce. So the full-time firefighters then worked 8 days. And again, like I said, it created the women in the fire service in Crystal Lake. This is a picture from 1985 when some standards started changing and we had to change the color of the equipment we had because they said we had to go to the yellow. So this is the department that it looked like in 1985, continuing to grow. Okay. This is also, go back to this, also at this time period, in 1986 is when the full-timers went 24 hours a day. Before that, they were, like I said, they worked Monday through Friday, basically 7 in the morning until 6 at night. And then in 1986 is when the full-time department, or when the department went from that going to 24/48, where certain members were assigned to a shift. They'd work a 24-hour shift. They'd start at 7 o'clock in the morning, get off the next morning at 7 o'clock. They wouldn't have to be back until 2 days later. And that continues for the Crystal Lake Fire Department to this day. Okay? We're still working at 24/48. We had 14 full-timers and 34 part-timers at this time. All right. 1967, we had the rescue of the Morgan Street Water Tower, which is probably one of the most interesting rescue calls at the time that we had up to that point that I can recall, and from what a lot of the older firemen would talk about. But we had an inspector inside the water tower that fell and hurt himself. We had to call in the U.S. Coast Guard, and they brought in the helicopter. And they had to package this patient up into the Stokes basket and raise him up. It was a very successful call. Nobody else got hurt. It went very smooth. And the reason why it went very smooth is our forefathers that taught us over the years, all their training, all their different types of things that they learned and everything else, continue to pass it on to the new people that came on with their mentoring system. And that's what helped make all these things go real nice and smooth. So that was quite a call. Okay? As time goes on, we get into the around the year 2000, and this was the fire department at the time. We continue to grow larger and continue to expand. In September 23rd of 1990, Station 4 at 8705 Bard Road opened up its doors and was staffed 24 hours a day. This would be the second station that would be staffed. So the main station on Woodstock Street was staffed with 6 members, 3 for the engine, 3 for the ambulance. And then when we opened up Station 4, we then dropped it down to 2 persons, 2 people for the engine, 2 people for the ambulance. So we had an ambulance and an engine on the south side of town, and we had an ambulance and an engine on the south side of town. And then we'd still have people that would come back on the larger incidents or when we got busy to man the extra equipment and all that. So that was in, like I said, 1991 is when we manned the second engine and dedicated it that way. Okay. Some of the other things that the fire department continued to go on to is the safety trailer. Our pub ed programs and everything else that we have, the Learn Not to Burn program and all that.
So the Crystal Lake Fire Rescue Association raised enough funds, got a real nice donation from Allstate Insurance, and we were able to purchase this nice safety trailer that we still have to this day, that we take to the different schools or different events and teach kids Learn Not to Burn. The Learn Not to Burn program has been so successful that when we go to teach them now as preschoolers and kindergartners, they already know it before we get there because their parents had it. They've already taught it, so it's very important. Some of our other pub ed stuff that we teach is when, staying low, crawling in smoke. A lot of times we set up different events for the kids so they can practice shooting the hose and stuff like that to get a good kick out of it. And then we'll do some of our other training that we have, specialized rescues or training that we have for doing different events. I'm just going to run, these are some other pictures that I came across. I'm going to just run through these real quick. I think they're kind of cool, looking at some of the equipment at the time. We don't have dates on some of these, or we don't know all the specifics on them, but some of them we do. So this is the equipment we had back in 1959. Okay. This is what the two phones on the wall there is how the phone calls came in. Right? One would go to the dispatch center. The other one there was painted red. We could also pick that up. Also, you see the large map there. Okay? That showed both the city and the district. So when calls came in, it was my understanding that on that file, those file boxes sitting on the shelf in the back there, is that especially if it was in a rural area, they'd open up that box to that farmer, and they would give them directions on how to get there. You see that sign that's reflective, says 4891. Those are what we called rural fire markers. They would put those at the driveway of all the people in the area. So if they knew that number, they'd give that number. And again, the fireman would get there, open up that drawer, go to that number, and they'd have directions on how to get there. And I believe they would take it out, leave it on top, so when the other members came in, they knew where to go to. I believe that was part of the whole program with it. And if I'm not mistaken, this is Chief Krecker. Am I right? Isn't it a young Chief Krecker here? Okay. Again, going out and shoveling out snows and heavy snowstorms. When we still